So, welcome to Devinterrupted. I'm your host, Andrew Ziegler.
And I'm your host, Ben Lloyd Pearson.
This week, we're talking about how AI can talk to each other now, how it can use tools, and ultimately the cost of politeness. What's first on your list, Ben?
Well, as someone who considers myself a polite person, I want to start there. What's our story on that one?
Okay, so this was a story this week where people really broke down the cost of saying things like please and thank you to ChatGPT. And in this case, it was really going deeper at the cost of, saying those words requires the LLM to process them just like any other part of your query, which ultimately uses more electricity, affects more of the environment. And people were even quantifying it in terms of spend, saying that being polite to ChatGPT costs the platform tens of millions of dollars. What do you think of this kind of polite madness?
Well, first of all, what if being polite gets you better answers and you don't have to do a second prompt? Well, then suddenly it becomes an energy saver, does it not?
I completely agree with that. Really, the breakaway here is people were arguing that saying please and thank you is a powerful way of expressing your meaning as part of your request. It also helps make the LLM understand the importance of what you're doing compared to other parts of your request. Ultimately, those words have function, right? It's like we say them to each other and we think that they might be empty. Maybe we don't need to say them to a machine, but semantically, they're playing a role in a lot of people's requests. But you know what, Ben? The one where maybe I agree with, maybe we could get rid of it is ending the chat session with just a thank you. I'm not sure what that does. Do you do
Yeah,
that?
a whole extra prompt. So, I used to be polite with my AI models, but I've come to think that they probably appreciate brevity over politeness. They have a natural tendency to be pretty polite, so I think they just kind of want to get to the point. But
Yeah, it's something I do commonly in scenarios where I get results that I do or don't like from an LLM is I ask it to like basically export, the instructions or the tone or the your concept of this conversation so I could share it with another LLM. Those kinds of kind of like plug and play prompt things are always very brief and very terse because the LLM knows it's talking to another LLM. It doesn't really need to be all that polite.
yeah, and I mean, speaking of which, we've covered on here how AI chooses more efficient languages when it's speaking to other AI bots. The human language is actually kind of inefficient when it comes to conveying meaning. But ultimately, I think it's kind of a waste of thought to think about the energy usage of stuff like this. For one, like these things always become more efficient over time. Like we're already seeing massive efficiency gains with AI. That's only going to continue, and then we're going to get to a point where the models that people use day to day, like maybe there's going to be some extreme ones that take a ton of energy to run, but the ones that we use day to day are probably going to be very efficient and pretty cheap to run. But if you want to be polite, I think it's a good habit to have. So just do it. It's probably more efficient to speak to AI in emojis anyway. So if you're not speaking in emojis, then you're already not as efficient as you can be. But, make a habit of being polite. Just don't expect that you're gonna, like, save the climate from doing so.
Completely.
Yeah, so let's talk about the, agents talking to each other, or AI talking to each other. What's our story on that one?
Oh, yeah. So, we were talking just a moment ago about how we communicate with AI and how we can be polite or not. Well, new on the scene from Google about like, recent weeks, if you're listening to this at Google Next, they announced the agent to agent protocol, which is a new protocol that allows an AI agent, an AI tool to call out to another AI in a structured, repeatable way that allows then developers to build these interactions at scale. It's similar to other things that have come onto the ecosystem lately that we're going to talk about a little bit more in just a moment. But agent to agent protocol or A to A protocol, if you've seen this come across your feed or in news, really just to break this down for you, it's kind of like the idea of your LLM in a local tool or in your client being able to call out almost like an AI call center, where there's another AI agent somewhere that can provide more in-depth information related to the tool or the process that you're doing. So, for example, if you have a local tool that has an AI built into it, and it needs to access maybe cloud data information on a third-party service or otherwise interact with another AI workflow somewhere, it could use A to A to have a structured and repeatable conversation that both sides can understand. And so this opens a whole new paradigm for how software developers should be thinking about building their products for LLM consumption. It's really showing that developers are not the only people that are going to be using your tools, and there's more dimensions in which AI will be acting in their behalf.
Yeah, and Google is they have a long history of establishing these sort of like industry standard organizations and practices and open source projects. So in very familiar hands, so to speak, when it comes to like a new protocol that we really need for this space. So and they brought in some really big companies, like we're seeing OpenAI, Hugging Face, Vercel. Those companies are already in the loop. There's I think like almost 50 of them or something that are a part of this. But, I think what we really need to think about here is that, AI is gonna fundamentally consume content and resources differently from humans. Like, we have built the information age to make it easier for humans to absorb information, process it, and do something with it. And, like you mentioned, like, human communication patterns often aren't the best for AI to AI interactions. So you even think about like an API, for example, like we built APIs for human developers to write code to interact with them. And some of those conventions will stay the same for AI, but many of them I think are likely to change, which kind of gets into this, the world that we're also seeing pop up a lot, like the model control protocol. Is that MCP? Is that the correct terminology? Uh,
Oh, the Model Context Protocol,
yeah,
MCP?
that's the one. Sorry, yeah. So like designing APIs and systems that are for machine consumption, which is pretty interesting.
Mhm.
So, and we're hearing more of this concept of agent experience that's heating up, and it's just another step along that journey. I think this is what we all kind of expected the AI maturity was going to look like.
Absolutely. It's really an evolving space, and this is even just one of the new things on the scene. There's other tools, other plays at force here with what an LLM can use.
Yeah, and of course, I already showed a little bit of my naivete around this subject, but Andrew, I don't know why I need an MCP server. And at this point, I'm kind of afraid to ask. So I've been told that you might be able to explain that to me with this last article that we've got today.
Oh, yes. Well, if you're asking yourself if you need one, well, I'm here to tell you that you need a lot of them. MCP servers are really going to be the future of how you can get more out of the applications and the tools that you're using. Um, Really, just in simplest terms, an MCP allows you to communicate in natural language into an application's like actual process. And what this means is, for example, being able to talk to a Word document, or I guess not, and being able to talk to applications that don't have traditionally accessible workflows or experiences for its users. And it's unlocking a lot of potential for people to get more out of the applications that they use every day. An example of a really great one from an article that was out by Andreessen Horowitz about MCP and its impact. One of the things showcased there was a Blender MCP server, which
Mm,
I found very great and compelling for showing how it would allow you to talk to an LLM, talk to Claude, talk to ChatGPT, and then give it structured, repeatable tools that it can use to apply your language to an application. So being able to talk to Blender effectively is what MCP will give you. Being able to talk directly to your applications without having to click 1,000 buttons, without having to do that long, intensive Google search, without having to go to ChatGPT and ask it, hey, how do I do this? Now you can tell ChatGPT to do it, and it'd be able to make those tool calls for you. And it does that with MCP servers. MCP servers expose functionality, APIs, and services to be consumed by LLMs And so this opens up an entire ecosystem where developers are thinking and reimagining how their tools and products are to be consumed by this new kind of like really legion of consumers. As you're going to learn from our guests, these consumers are calling these tools at a massive scale, and there's a huge call to action to build and supply these types of tools. So does that kind of clear up what MCP is for you?
Yeah, actually, it clears it up very well. And I think what you're describing is vibe productivity.
It's not
Uh,
too far off, you know. It takes it one step further because you can even connect things like MCP servers to your maybe traditional, if you can call it that, vibe coding client. So you could connect MCP servers to Cursor to be able to add that tool calling to your vibe coding experience. So, for
yeah,
example, something I did of this recently, hacking around in Cursor, and what I was building had a telnet server, and I used an MCP telnet protocol server within Cursor so that I would be able to talk to its own application. So now I could talk to Cursor, it could build, and we could iterate through it together. And then it had the functionality to call and launch its own server and then talk to it over telnet and figure out if it was working or if it was broken or if it needed to iterate in a different direction. So that's a fully closed feedback loop. I could practically observe that as a developer with very
yeah.
little influence. So it really opens up a whole new world of thinking and using.
Yeah, I definitely feel here's what I think I'd taken away from this. We're rapidly entering a future where natural language is going to become a pretty common interface to a lot of different tools. So think about any tool that you use out there. You're probably going to start having a conversation with it before too long. And I think Blender is a great example because that is such an amazing application, but has such a steep learning curve that if you can use AI and natural language to get around that, like you know, I don't know how much this would help a seasoned Blender veteran, for example, but someone who's
Mhm.
new to it and needs to learn it, like I could absolutely see this being a massive benefit.
Yeah. It really levels the playing field for everybody with creativity and determination to be able to enact change in ways that they haven't before.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, I think we have a guest today that is going to talk about MCP servers for the first time in Devinterrupted history. Why don't you tell us about who we have today, Andrew?
Oh, yes. So our guest today, his name is Sagar Batchu, and he's going to really reorient you about how you think about your APIs and your tools. Because if you think that your API problem is just some bad docs or clunky endpoints, well, I'm sorry, but the whole field has changed. And Sagar is going to break that down for us and show how you and your team can take best advantage of it. Because it turns out that the real problem with your API design is probably in your org chart. So stay tuned. Today, we're discussing how building APIs isn't just a technical problem, it's an organizational challenge. And to break this down for us, we have Sagar Batchu, co founder and CEO of Speakeasy. He spent years scaling enterprise APIs, tackling developer experience challenges, and now he's solving the messy reality of API adoption at scale. Sagar, welcome to the show.
Angie, thanks so much for having me back. It's great to be here again.
Yeah, it's great to have you, and we're really excited to dig in. APIs are something that's been around for a long time, but they're constantly evolving. They're fickle monsters for sure, and the definitions for what makes something an API and what makes it successful seem to keep shifting. So I'm really excited to dig into this conversation, tap into some of your wisdom and what you're seeing out there in the field. I want to start though by setting the stakes, again for our listeners. If you're a company with an API product, you probably want to be the next Stripe or Twilio, and you want a killer API, you want a developer friendly experience, and you want that sweet self-serve adoption. You want it to be easy and you want it to be frictionless for people to actually integrate your API into what they're building and using. But even API first companies can struggle to make APIs a priority. So, Sagar, where do you see successful APIs begin in a company?
Yeah, it's a great question, Andrew. And I wholeheartedly agree with this idea that APIs are more an organizational problem than a technical one. The technology of running an API is largely commoditized. But what makes running a great API comes down to how a company is set up to uh, bring that API to market, to evolve it, to design it, to serve customers. So I think it really starts internally with a sense of excellence, right? Wanting to put out the best API out there for your business. I think for most companies, APIs are actually, a post product market fit problem in that
Mm.
you have to figure out what your business does, what superpower does your business give users, whether they're developers or consumers or whatever user out there. Once you figure that out, an API can be a massive accelerant. It can be a differentiator. It can be a go-to-market emotion. It can be a developer tool, kind of an ecosystem enabler. And I think because of that, it's really a post PMF question. So I think obviously, you have to figure out your business first. But once you do, I'm sure every founder, every business owner will say they want to have their product or business be the best. And I think an API is no different. It's a product. And so I think it starts with a center of excellence around that internally. Very similar to, how products are very visual, like some of the best apps we use, like social platform apps. They have huge design teams internally that kind of obsess over every micro interaction, every component in the user experience. Um, like the stories of designers from Airbnb and Instagram and how they're kind of best designers in the industry. I think API design is similar. Like if you want the best designed API, you need people who know what that looks like, who have a pulse on the ecosystem of API development. What makes APIs maybe more challenging than user experience sometimes, I think, is, or underappreciated, is that once you put an API out there, it's very hard to roll back, right? There's kind of the saying around APIs that all APIs are stuck on V1. It's very hard to evolve them because you're basically putting something out there that other businesses will build on top of. And so it becomes a dependency. And so change management is a very difficult concept for these businesses. So yeah, long-winded way of saying, I think it really starts center of excellence and making sure someone internally owns how the API looks and feels. And I think that's a really good place to start.
You make a really good point, drawing some parallels between teams that care a lot about design or about the user experience, investing resources into that, putting time and energy into those teams to actually prop up that experience. And so within a company, if a company is building an API that they're going to serve to, their customers or to their end users, is there a specific place in the company where you see that most successfully start? Is that something that maybe is democratized between a bunch of teams, or is it siloed in one place?
Yeah, I think when you're small, it's good to just have a single owner. And if you're a small business with a small API, just one API, then yeah, I think you just need one team owning it end to end, from design to deployment to developer tooling and the ongoing maintenance. But once you get to scale, often we find that individual products have their own APIs. And this is where like Conway's law becomes really applicable, right?
Yeah.
Conway's law being that it kind of states we end up shipping product that looks like our business than what the customer wants. So if you have 5 teams, your API is going to look like it was designed by 5 different people. Um, and I think what you want to do to avoid that, in my opinion, is you want to enable all your teams to ship APIs if that's your business strategy. Absolutely. Give them the tools, enable them to do that. But before it goes out to production, I think it's important to have a single API owner. Sometimes this is called an API platform team at a company, larger ones who ensure kind of a governance of standards. They play the role of governance of standards across all the APIs. And so internally, it's 5 teams developing an API, but externally, from the customer's point of view, it looks like this was one person that designed it. So that's kind of the organizational structure that I usually recommend to folks is, if you're a small company, it's a simple problem. Don't try to distribute the problem. If you're a big company, just make sure there's a kind of last mile gate in place to ensure a consistent design experience.
Just like how you'd have like a product manager that's in charge at the very end, a sole owner of what is going to be used by the end user or whoever's going to be consuming your application, right? And that person, their job is to liaison between all the different teams and all the different assets and all the different needs to make sure it is a cohesive experience. What you're calling out with APIs is really top of mind for me too. I think of all the best APIs I've used, and even if like they had huge varieties of stuff that they could do, or like a lot of different endpoints that maybe are very different from each other. At the end of the day, they all kind of still have the same shape, the same smell, at least the successful ones that I use and that get sticky. So it makes sense that you'd have one person or one team kind of owning it before it goes out the door. And that's like how an API first company would like adopt that, would think and would organize themselves with that mentality. But does any of this matter if you're not an API first company? If you're maybe building internal or self-serve APIs, does this become less important?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the APIs are a little bit like the iceberg effect, where you have the majority of APIs actually internal, and so like below the waterline is actually all those millions of internal APIs we don't see, and then the ones above the waterline are like the few API first businesses that also have external facing APIs. And so actually,
Mm,
yeah, most of it is actually an internal problem. With the internal case, like sure, there isn't as much of I think you're somewhat more inoculated from design inconsistencies because the user is fundamentally more tolerant being an internal user. However, I think designing with the same principles in place will lead to a good outcome. But internally, the problems we see are less about consistency, quality, and governance, and more around discoverability, access, and kind of development speed or ease of development. And so I think for companies focused on this as an internal problem, I would actually start by saying a lot of the first step really comes down to like discovery and cataloging and making sure you have the tools in place to know all the APIs that you have. And I'm talking really big companies with, hundreds of product teams. The few that we work with where, yeah, they have incredible number of internal APIs, and they've done such a good job enabling their teams to build new ones that like they spawn left and right. And so they need kind of a and there's they need kind of a structure or methodology around keeping track of them. It can be done through tooling and automation, of course, but yeah, it's a slightly different flavor of the same problems.
yeah. When you're a large company or a small company, and then suddenly you need something like that's easy to scale or serve to your developer teams, then that's kind of where an API might come into the mix. So, in your experience in the teams that you've worked with, are there scenarios where like maybe one day a company wakes up and they're like, "Oh, we need to organize around an internal API. We need to provide something in an API like way for our developers to be using." Or is that a problem that's kind of native to the company? Like when you founded that company, you already knew that that was the problem you were going to solve, versus it's something that just pops up one day.
Yeah, it's a good question too. I think a large number of companies we see, like they don't realize that this is coming. Like they don't realize this is an issue. I think what happens is they hit PMFs and they start scaling. And when you talk to founders who have hit PMS, they come under such pressure to start scaling the business, and there's like incredible demands. And so I don't think they necessarily always foresee down the road how the API could become messy or difficult to work with. Right.
Yeah.
And so there's a yeah, and you can't blame anyone, right? Because they're kind of focused on growth, and everything else kind of comes second. Um, yeah, I think people don't foresee it, but there are steps you can take up front to actually ensure that long term, as you grow, the API design and API usage doesn't suffer. It comes down to simple things like adopting standards of development. If you're a REST developer, OpenAPI is a great standard and kind of gives you this escape hatch into the rest of the ecosystem, however big or small you are. There's things like that you can adopt from early on.
Yeah. Something that keeps sticking out to me in what you've described is just how important that ownership must be for the API within a company or the API strategy, and
Yeah.
how important it is that if it's something that is going to be saving your developers time or you're going to be serving as a product, how you have to structure around it and how you have to strive for a level of excellence. Because when I think of internal APIs, in my experiences, I often think of like internal developer portal or something where a bunch of teams would have self-serve versions of something they're building for each other. And it always ends up in this weird no man's land where it's kind of like part of the infrastructure or infrastructure team, it's part of the product team in some regards. Some of the engineering team owns it. So exactly what you've described kind of happens. You get like this sprawl, API sprawl of a bunch of different approaches of a bunch of different solutions. And so one really great takeaway so far is about unifying the ownership of the
Hmm.
API into one place. That way it can be leveraged effectively. And even if your company is not like an API first or serving an API as its first bread and butter, you have to be able to organize yourself around solving those problems for when they do come up. And I'm wondering, what are the like successful like habits or practices that you see engineering teams that do manage to achieve that excellence and strive for that excellence? Is there like a common theme that you see between them besides just caring a lot about their APIs?
Yeah. I think, caring about your APIs, the way that it manifests is understanding customer usage. Um,
Mm,
I think if you were a designer and you were designing a UI, you probably look at things like session recordings, and there's a whole suite of tools on like tracking how customers are moving on your screen, doing user interviews. I think an API is no different. It's just the way it manifests is slightly, the metrics you look for are different. You probably want to track which parts of the API are getting used the most, which is the least, like error rates. There's a great metric I like to call time to 200, which is the time to your first successful call as a user. You probably want to track that over time as well. Like always should be trending down. Um, so there's, I think really caring about it comes down to the design, but also comes down to like monitoring in real time and making
right.
decisions based on that. Yeah.
There's a lot of importance in measuring to
Mm.
understanding the vernacular, the language of the goals that you're striving for. Time to first 200 is a great example because you can look at someone's journey along the way. It takes them longer. Over time, your users get to their first successful call faster and faster. You can look at the factors that play into that. And then you can iterate over time because API is, they're just like any other type of software development. You can measure it. You can put actions in place to improve it, and then you can track it over time. Um, and APIs, the ones that we've discussed so far, that's a very traditional format of how APIs have been built and consumed. But, there's definitely a little bit of an elephant in the room around APIs right now with LLMs and especially agentic AI coming onto the scene, because we're living in a world where these tools, what makes them agentic and what makes these LLMs so powerful to work with is their ability to do tool usage and to call
Hmm.
out to things like these APIs. So
Hmm.
suddenly, now you have like a split user base. That time the 200 that you've been measuring might have always represented a human, but now that there's maybe even a machine in the mix that is using your API like how a developer once would. So that kind of rewrites, I think, the playbook for everything about like beautiful documentation, interactive sandboxes, the developer experience. What has been your perspective as like an API expert, someone building an API company, that you've been seeing as LLMs come on the scene of these API callers?
Yeah. I think, what's really interesting, and I think you alluded to, is like as these new interfaces come online, there's an even more of a demand to actually do the traditional things well, right? Even more, because one way to like if look at it from outside in is there's just more API consumers now, and there's more API calls, and there's going to be more usage. And so API builders, you want to prioritize the things that people have always said you should prioritize on design, like have an API spec, make sure it's maintained, make sure it's accurate. Those things only further become more important when the integrators are not just humans, but also agentic workflows, probably doing 10 times as many API calls as standard static integration would do. So
Wow,
that's
10
kind of one
times as
place I'm
many? You think that would be the scale you see?
finger in the air, right? But I think
Yeah.
I think it is a order of magnitude change. I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay. I like the idea of just zooming out and just being like, there's more demand, you have more users, but you have to stick with the traditional core basics of what makes your APIs successful. All of those original things stay true. I think that's been a universal takeaway in software engineering that a lot of like leaders and folks have been learning along the way, is that all of those things that did matter, they still matter. And in fact, in some cases, they matter even more because when you scale those fundamentals, they become even more impactful. So talking you throw out the number just like 10x. Obviously, that's like just an idea of their API usage. But you know, I guess also looking at how APIs are used and adopted. Like I think of my own perspective um, as like a developer who's used a lot of APIs
Mhm.
and has also created a lot of resources for folks to use APIs. Is that a lot of that boils down to having that really delightful developer experience that's self-starting, has that really easy to use documentation. Maybe it has the spec that you can play with right on the website, right? We're all familiar with these ways of reducing friction to that first successful API call. But when you are now maybe building at scale for LLMs that are going to call your APIs 10 times, maybe they don't care about that developer experience. Is that what you've seen, or is it a different kind of developer experience?
Yeah, the industry is already kind of gravitating to terms like agent experience, AX instead of DX. And
Oh,
it's
interesting.
fun. Yeah, it's funny. There's a lot of people love these buzzwords and kind of marketing stuff that comes from it. What I would say is when I double click on it, it does come down to actually a lot of the same things. Not all, but it comes down to like how good of a grasp do you have on the API. And I think one thing I would recommend to companies is more isn't better, actually. I think companies that have APIs, the smaller and simpler and clearer your API is, the better. Like the truth is that people probably don't want to do everything with your product programmatically. Most of the usage is probably still going to be through like the UI or like whatever else you expose. The API often serves the one or two use cases really well, like something that should be programmatic. And so I always like start by asking customers, when they bring us an API spec and we make these SDKs and other tools from them, do you want to expose everything in the spec, right? Do you just want to start with one or two or three operations in the spec? Like if you're a payments company, do you just want to start with create payment? Like create payment, get payment, delete payment, update payment, like that's it. And then do you want to expand outwards from there? Instead of like dumping, 100 different operations to your customer in the first go. Um, and what happens, I think, there is like you do that, and suddenly you may have 100 operations you exposed, two get 90% of the usage, and then 90 get like 10% of the usage, but you can't get rid of those 90 now, right? Because there's 10% usage, but it's not really a game changer for anyone, and so you put yourself in
Right.
a tough spot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think in that sense, like I always tell them to start small, and with agents, I think it's even more true. Like context is really important. The context you can provide these models and agentic workflows. So the simpler your API is, the better documented, described examples, like it's all compounding in value. I've done experiments now with a lot of APIs where like just throwing an API spec into Claude or some other LM and using it is okay, or into even my IDE is okay. But if I instead of that, actually give it a documentation side, good examples, um, maybe an SDK with like pre-built valid examples, it flies all of a sudden. Like it goes from being a fun little tool, fun little like demo to actually, oh my God, this could 10x my day-to-day productivity. So in this new world, context matters a lot more. And so, yeah, I would start with small, simple APIs. Don't try to like expose your whole product to the world through an API. And then the stuff that is exposed, make sure it's thoroughly documented, the examples, all of that good stuff.
Yeah, start simple, start small, and when it comes to, planning for the future and your LLM users, all of those same traditional things that mattered before in terms of developer experience, they still matter. Because, like you said, you give all those examples, you give that documentation, you give the schema to the LLM, it's going to do better if it has those kind of prepared resources, just like how a developer would. So, it's really kind of like, you wanna keep marching towards that goal. The goal hasn't changed. It's just that maybe your number of users, maybe the velocity at which you're getting there is going to be changing. Something else too that comes to mind is, we talked a lot about how these traditional APIs have been like built and served. There's also a new idea on the scene that I know you've
Mhm.
been thinking a lot about with MCP or Model Context Protocol. And this is what allows an LLM to work directly with tools and with APIs. I'd
Yeah.
love to hear from your perspective what you think about this, how you're seeing it impact workflows, and kind of what you think people in software leadership should be paying attention to right now with MCP.
Yeah, great question. I think the really interesting thing with MCP, and you're right, it's kind of become really hot and just come to the forefront is since we started working with these LLMs, like the thing that everyone has been excited about is how easy it is to use them and get like kind of this magical experience. But the big gap has been determinism. Like, how do you ensure that the stuff that it gives you is always accurate, it's relevant, it's consistent? And I think agentic tools like MCP are really the gateway into this. I think it takes LLMs and agents more broadly from being, like discovery and search tools to actually being operational tools. Um, with MCP in particular, so for those of you not familiar with it, it basically is a protocol, a schema that defines the resources of an API an agent has access to, or an LM has access to, and calling that API. So it's like a level of indirection above an API spec with a little bit of extra examples, concepts that allow for access control and scoping of resources the LM has access to. And so that's really all it is. Um, and I think with this, what we like very early, but what we're seeing is people are creating MCP servers for different APIs, and then they add it to their clients. A client in this case is actually like your Claude desktop or Cursor IDE, and suddenly they have access to that API. And the cool thing is they're not even saying please use this tool. They just you just continue with what you wanted to do, and there's enough context in these tools that the LLMs agents actually decide when to use the tools. So there's that like automatic decisioning that's happening. Um, and so, yeah, like I was able to, create an MCP servers for our GitHub and Slack. And then suddenly I'm able to ask questions like how many GitHub issues have customers opened? What's the latest issue? What's the highest priority one? Claude goes from being my, kind of LM that I use for search and knowledge and all of that to actually doing operational work, which is like a huge leap in how useful AI could be for us. Um, so yeah, I think as a leader, I would actually start by even before investing in the stuff for your product, investing for your productivity of your team. I think people should be playing with these things and kind of the use cases are going to evolve as people get creative. But start by I think identifying like an internal workflow, something that you probably tool up yourself or use another SaaS product to kind of orchestrate for you. I think you could actually just do a lot of that to having the right MCP servers for the right APIs. And that's something we're really excited as well to kind of get into and see if we can help enable.
Yeah. And that's a really great call out too that paying attention to your internal developers, your developer productivity, measuring and understanding how people are working and consuming these tools. And kind of what you described as well, kind of makes me think of that MCP is kind of like the developer experience for the LLM, for these agents to use. Is providing that last mile that is helpful for it to be able to make the context to decide when to use it when you're already just natively using the tool. So does that mean that all APIs that are going to be popularly consumed by developers should be going the direction of being available that way? Or is that something that like how do you decide as a company or someone with an API that it's like we should be implementing MCP. We should follow this track.
Yeah, luckily implementing MCP is reasonably easy. And I think products like our own actually make it a lot easier to get into this ecosystem. I think if your API or product has, any value in terms of, day-to-day operational use, right? Things that you want. Like let's even take a simple example, right? Like I think it's pretty intuitive for most users today. They will probably have this idea of like, I wish I could kind of dump all my personal notes into this LM and all my Apple notes and to do and tasks and have it become kind of a store and memory of this stuff. Like I think that is one of the more early intuitive use cases people have. That's actually possible now because of MCP. A lot of task note-taking products have APIs, and so you can actually create a tool that allows your LM to interface with that. And so now you like the idea of task note-taking memory is no longer like an operational task. You just have to, talk in natural language to LM, and it will automatically update all of these tasks and notes for you. So, um, yeah, I think that this, like anything in your API that's stateful, it's a really exciting thing to explore. Um, and also I would say, like lighthouse companies should just try this out, right? See, it's much like an SDK or putting an API out there in the first place. You have a hunch of what it's going to be used for, but I'm sure the best API ecosystems didn't start knowing that the API was going to get used in all these different ways. So I would put it out there and kind of trust the users to see what are the interesting workflows that get created.
Yeah. And do you think that like with the rise of all of this and with MCP coming on the scene and there being more ways that you can modify and serve your APIs, do you think that will create a new business model for companies that serve APIs? Like we started by talking about API first. Is there going to be an MCP first company one day? How does that modify like the future, do you think, from the teams that you're seeing that are combining these technologies?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think most of the disruption, I think, is actually on the consumer side
Mm,
of the problem, and less on the producer side. Like producers have to keep building APIs, making them better, making them accessible. I think consumers suddenly have at their fingertips a very powerful set of tools, the integration. And even before integration, I would say for like discovery and testing and understanding how to work with APIs. I think as it becomes more deterministic over time, you'll see actual live integrations run off of these tools. So yeah, I think will there be like tool first APIs? I don't know. I think it really depends on how usage evolves. Um, but I think yeah, there's more disruption to be had on the consumer side of the landscape first.
yeah, makes a lot of sense. Um, with all the things that we've covered, we've talked about like the journey of APIs within a company and its evolution and kind of how teams should be thinking about adopting and using it. We've talked about the importance of developer productivity internally and measuring the usage of these tools, but also how your developers are able to build and impact with them. Um, you know, uh, if we talked also a bit about how APIs get kind of packaged up and served, right? Like with SDKs or with MCP, and it's just like these are wrappers around something that you're serving. What it ultimately boils down to is you have to have excellence driving towards these tools that you're serving. I think that's a universal thing in software engineering. We all show up because we want to create a really great product. We want to make the best thing possible. And APIs just become a tool for that. Um, are there any other kind of like high level takeaways that you want to maybe set the stage for people to think about APIs. It's a very long-standing topic that's been around for a while, but it's getting some, reinvention lately. There's a lot of new things on the scene. What about like with what y'all are building at Speakeasy? Is there something kind of like top of mind that you think that the future is really moving towards?
Yeah, I think what I will say is that we are in day zero, like innings -1 of this process.
Yeah.
Um, I think I think people sometimes underappreciate how important APIs are to our like daily life, right? And so, if APIs start functioning incorrectly, your banking system doesn't work, your booking systems don't work. Like everything we do is an API call, like your DoorDash order, whatever it is. And so I think the changes are going to start more, to be honest, on the like what I would call exploratory side, right? It's going to be experimental. It's going to start with like people trying this stuff out. The really big breakthroughs, I think, is going to come when there are actual operational changes, right? So when like real systems, real teams actually start doing things differently because of the evolution of how LLMs interact with APIs. So I think we're very, very early, and I'm excited to see it evolve. In terms of what we're doing, like Speakeasy's mission has always been to provide really the modern tool chain for API development, all the way from kind of design, testing to distribution of an API. And so we work a lot with API producers. However, there's been such an explosion in this world, we've kind of quickly added agentic tooling support. We generate MCP servers just off of your API spec for you now. So we're getting involved in that way, and then also probably take us towards really more work around agentic tooling, hosting the tools, running them, providing evaluation toolkits on top. So yeah, we want to help people have the best APIs, which, as you rightly pointed out, is also going to include having the best agentic tools now. So it's really been an expansion of our mandate and our mission.
Yeah, and it's about bringing the tools to the end users. That's a really good call out that you made, is that like a lot of the work to be done, a lot of the change that will happen is going to happen on that exploratory side, on the user adoption side, and the ways that they can interact with these types of tools. Well, Sagar, this has been really fascinating to kind of get in your head and learn a little bit of how you think about APIs, and with with MCP coming on the scene as well. And it's been really interesting to get a glimpse at the challenges and opportunities that face these kind of companies that are building these internally or serving them to customers, how they're prioritizing things like developer productivity and excellence, and how that impacts their end result. And really, like you said in the beginning, really well, it boils down to Conway's law, and that you need to structure how your company is around what it's producing. That your company's structure reflects what you ultimately put out into the market. So in order to get that product market fit, in order to create that really delightful experience for your users, you got to match where your users are and what they're looking for. And Sagar, I'm also curious, where can people learn a little bit about Speakeasy and what y'all are building if, after this conversation, folks wanted to go learn more?
Yeah, absolutely. I love ending it on Conway's law. It determines so much of what I think businesses do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. To learn a little bit more about Speakeasy, you can find us at speakeasy.com. We also have very active X and LinkedIn accounts. So on X, it's Speakeasy Dev, and on LinkedIn, Speakeasy API. We're also very approachable, reachable team. We have, Slack spaces linked on our website. Come in, chat with us anytime. We're doing a lot of work. We have a kind of change log that tracks our progress. Doing a lot of work in agentic tools, and if you're looking to adopt MCP in your own business, or just looking to try it out, let us know. We can definitely help you out.
Absolutely. So we'll get all of that included in our show notes. So if you've been listening and this has caught your interest, definitely be sure to check that out. And as well, if you've been listening, thank you so much for joining us this far. You've made it, all the way to the end, which means that you clearly liked it, and this was a cool conversation for you. So please like and subscribe. Please check us out on Substack. And also reach out to us. Sagar and myself, we're both on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you, continue this conversation. So definitely please give us a ping on socials. So that's it for this week's Dev Interrupted, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Andrew.